Okay, dear friends, I am Artie Kasakian, a member of the Glendale City Council, resident of Glendale, a human being, resident of this planet that we all share. And I'm bringing to you interviews with people who I have come to know, respect, admire. Some of them I'm very fortunate to call a friend, like my guest today. Dr. Jermaine McCalpin is an internationally recognized expert and consultant on transitional justice, genocides, and reparation. He has traveled to South Africa, Cambodia, Armenia, across the United States and Canada, researching and presenting on the Armenian genocide as just one of the topics, but overall speaking about reparations in a number of areas of conflict and post-conflict, and including reparations for the transatlantic trade in Africans. So I want to welcome you, Jermaine. Thank you, Professor, Doctor, for joining us. How are you?
I'm good.
We're doing well. We're doing okay. I mean, it's very hard, I think, for many Armenians to see what's happening.
Are you on the west side? Are you here now?
Yes, I'm in California. We're in Glendale, California, and you know, we're doing well. We're doing okay. I think that many Armenians are watching what's happening in their homeland right now and are very concerned. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that specifically.
Sure.
Given the current escalation of violence in Artsakh, and especially the aggressive actions taken by Azerbaijan as they're being assisted by the Republic of Turkey, some have gone as far as to say that this is a repeat of the attempt or an attempt of completing the Armenian genocide. Curious, I know because you've been following this as well, what is your view and take on the current war and what is happening in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh?
There are several layers, Artie, that I've been observing, and one of the layers, the primary layer, is a proxy war. It's almost a proxy war of aggression. I use another C. It's a continuation of genocidal aggression, because really there have been ebbs and flows over the last 105 years. And so that's how I think of it, that these kinds of aggressive militarization in that part of the world is a continuation of genocidal aggression. So I think of the current military campaign pointing to a new strategy of aggression, you know, where regional conflict has the potential to not just destabilize, but to take focus away from Turkey's own historic denial, and also provided in Azerbaijan an ally that can continue to do its bidding as it pertains to continuing a kind of strategy that it has done over the last 105 years. It's really a war of attrition, right? Hoping that Armenia is isolated long enough in its fight for and with Artsakh, so it can be worn down, so that Armenia and Artsakh's resistance would become weaker and weaker. So it's really a proxy war initiated essentially by Azeri aggression, primarily because I think of Azerbaijan, to use a feudal term, as a vassal of Turkey.
Yes, well, so you know, I agree with everything that you say, because you know, Armenia is definitely right now. I just told a group, an audience yesterday, that you know, if it wasn't clear before, certainly the Armenian people in Armenia and Artsakh are very keenly aware that their only ally is, if they have an ally, it's not any nation state, but really the diaspora and Armenians in the various communities that they're in. Yet, you know, during all this, one of the, I think you've studied this, so I would like to know your opinion about what do you feel are the root causes, or what do you think are the root causes of this hatred and animosity towards Armenians being spoken by people like Erdogan in Turkey and Ilham Aliyev, or the Aliyevs in Azerbaijan?
You know, I think part of what I see, this kind of hatred and this kind of aggression, you know, one thinks of it in terms of a religious perspective, you know, but in many ways it is far more nefarious and longitudinal than that. You know, as Azerbaijan functioning as Turkey's vassal is almost doing the warring and the bidding on behalf of Turkey. And so I think the desire to carry out this kind of, how would I put it, this kind of slow burn extermination in such a way that Armenia becomes at the mercy of both Azerbaijan and Turkey. And that is why I think the Armenian community, the Armenian diaspora, but also citizens of the world who are concerned about justice, who are concerned about sovereignty, who are concerned about history and the role of history in the continuation of human atrocities in the present, must come to Armenia's defense. This is not just a question of two states warring over quote disputed territory. This is a question of a long-standing atrocity, a long-standing genocidal strategy that is now moving into a more, kind of nefarious stage. Clandestine nonetheless, because people would say, well, it's just fighting, right? It's just fighting. But when these two countries are involved, given their history, it's not just fighting. Like I said, it's a continuation of genocidal aggression. This vitriol is born of almost a kind of insistence on seeing Armenia as a victimized people. And so you continue the victimization, right? Because how dare you stake a claim to not just sovereignty, but sovereignty of Artsakh, right? It's flying in the face of its larger neighbors and those that are involved in the conflict. So I think those are some of the things that we see. Turkey's leader Aliyev in Azerbaijan and Erdogan in Turkey. When you look at the kind of demagoguery and the kind of rhetoric that focuses on essentially placing the burden on the people who are aggrieved already, continues the strategy of those who commit genocide, that the victims are further criminalized, right? If you look at all the genocides across history, even if we want to do the long 19th century, from the 1700s with the with the native peoples in the US and in Australia and in Canada, if we want to do the people, the Namaqua and Herero people in Namibia.
Yeah.
If we want to do the Armenians, if we want to do the Circassians, if we want to do any of these types of genocides that have occurred, what we begin to see is a justification from the perpetrator group that there was something in the actions and the predations of the victims that justify this kind of thing.
Let me ask you one question. It's interesting to me that, well, I mean, I have a lot of things to say, and I know that your time is short, but has there ever been an instance of, you look at the numbers, right? To me, it seems illogical when you have a country of Armenia, which is roughly 3 million people, just shy of that, and Artsakh, which is 150,000 people, which has a smaller population than the city of Glendale, California. Correct. And the claims on the other side by Azerbaijan, which has roughly 9 million people, and Turkey, which has over 80 million people, that somehow Armenians are the ones perpetrating genocide. I mean, how is that legitimized? I mean, has there been an instance in history? I mean, I know about the genocide of the Herero people, and the Hereros were brutally persecuted and massacred by, I believe it was it the Belgians? I'm sorry?
The Germans.
The Germans, yes. And as a colonizing force, and perhaps those are instances where you have a larger population that has been subjugated or mercilessly murdered by a smaller group. But still, if you take into consideration technological advancement and the tools that were used, they had far greater power in committing those genocides upon those native indigenous populations.
Yeah, one of the clear variations between genocides of the pre-20th and more recent genocides is the question not just of technology, but the reality that I call genocides extreme nation building projects, right? It's an attempt to craft an image of the nation state where some people are accepted and some people are not, right? That begins the justification for the Armenian genocide. It reaches its apex, or certainly its descent into banality, around the time that the Kemalist movement is going to emerge. What was that movement geared towards? an extreme understanding of Turkish nationalism that would not and could not accommodate Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks. And so when we think of it, yes, there have been times in history, but like you said, forces of technology and forces of craft were on the side of the smaller group. In this case, it is certainly not so, because given the armament that Turkey is, capable of, and certainly Azerbaijan, 3.1 million people, with a standing army that certainly does not rival even one of the regiments of Turkey. The argument to me doesn't seem to be logical, but I get it, because those who perpetrate acts of violence across history, whether we call them genocides or massacres, those people tend to provide an inverted justification that those people who are aggrieved are actually the aggressors. Yeah. And we see that inversion all the time.
And in addition to that, Jermaine, you also see that any attempt by the victim to resist is justified by the perpetrator as, well, it was a conflict. You see that a number of times, that if the victims try to resist, armed resistance, defense, that it somehow gets portrayed as, well, we were settling scores, it was a war.
Yeah, and you see that, and I begin to think of the analog in many of the social justice protests here in the US, often just dismissively called, oh, these Black Lives Matter protests, but they're really ultimately social protests. And what you have is that when those who are aggrieved begin to protest and begin to declare their humanity and their right to be humans, which is what Malcolm X says, that we declare our rights to be human beings, that now is taken to mean that these people are disruptive, they are looting, they are radical. All these kinds of nomenclature are being used. When you extrapolate that to the Armenian situation, these people who are actually defending the cause of their sovereignty and of their humanity are being told are the aggressors, right? And so it's not surprising to me. It has been in the playbook of aggressors and demagogues for centuries.
I look at one of the most popular American musicals now is Hamilton, and you look at Hamilton and you harken back to the foundation of this nation's history, and it was based on a group of colonies that were seen as part of the sovereign Kingdom of England, of the United Kingdom, and when they did not appreciate the relationship or the terms of that relationship, they asserted their rights with a Declaration of Independence, which was met by force, by killing, by brutality, by military action by the British, which was then resisted by military action, although albeit amateur, until the colonials were able to formalize into some semblance of a military to resist, declaring their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To me, it's no different than what the people of Artsakh did at the fall of the Soviet Union. It's no different than what Toussaint Louverture did, and a number of causes throughout. Toussaint Louverture, of course, being the Haitian commander who tried to resist and gain independence and freedom for his people in the Caribbean.
And also helped to gain independence for several Latin American countries by assisting Simon Bolivar to liberate many of these countries from Spanish colonization. So
this narrative gets flipped on its head now, and all of a sudden what's good for one group of people is not good for another group. And it seems if these rights are universal, then people should be rallying to the cause of oppressed peoples wherever they are.
I'll tell you an interesting conversation from my class, because I teach 2 classes on the American Civil Rights Movement and the African diaspora. And yesterday's conversation was about going back to some of the ideas espoused by Malcolm X, because he's often thought of as this divisive character. And I read an excerpt from a message to the grassroots and speech on the Black Revolution that a Muslim gave at a Christian church nonetheless. And he said, George Washington had to use violence in order to get freedom. Patrick Henry had to articulate this notion of violence in order to get his freedom. Why? Because they thought that they were convinced of the right to declare not just independence, but their ability, their self-determination. And that point is sometimes lost, that people have the right of self-determination to determine how they will organize their polity, whether that polity is small and have more aggressive, larger neighbors, or that polity is large, right? The right of self-determination is why we have a United Nations. It's why we had the League of Nations. All of humanity is bound up with this right of self-determination. And that is what ultimately Artsakh and Armenia are articulating, the right to self-determination.
Now, you've studied restorative justice around the world. Assuming this conflict can come to an end and Azerbaijan recognizes Artsakh, which I don't see happening under the current regime in Baku, but stranger things have happened, and we need to have hope that people will do the right thing. What do you think is a path towards restorative justice? How would that look like in this particular situation?
You know, Artie, one of the things about restorative justice that I think is the preconditions of restorative justice that is missing from this is that, like you said, I don't see the likelihood of this question of, accountability, right? Responsibility. Because the first step towards restorative justice is accepting that a wrong was done, right? If we can think of the ways in which we talk about restorative justice, it's not just, okay, all we do is just sing and hold hands and we become a community again. No, it is premised on accountability. So restorative justice is not an abnegation of responsibility. It's a more nuanced understanding of responsibility that doesn't focus on retribution, but it focuses on responsibility, right? And we oftentimes talk about reparations without talking about responsibility. Because if you provide monetary compensation for me, but never admitting that you did a wrong, that is not reparations, because that is not responsible compensation, right? That is hush money, right? That is to keep me silent, but that is not to acknowledge and be responsible concerning my aggrieving, right? So when we talk about restorative justice, responsibility has to be there, and acceptance and admission, not now a question of guilt, but more of accountability, right? Restorative justice focuses on accountability and responsibility, and not necessarily the legalistic presumption of guilt or innocence. Because in this case, we are not talking about guilt or innocence. This is not a court of law, but what we are talking about is responsibility and accountability.
Yeah. When I had an opportunity to visit both South Africa and Namibia, and
Yes.
I really was I marveled at what Mandela and the ANC was able to do post that conflict, given how bloody and brutal it was, how the Black South African people were brutalized for so many years, yet the ability to move, I don't want to say completely past that, but their process is one that is truly exemplary.
It is, but what I wouldn't want for the condition, for the situation we're talking about in Artsakh and Armenia to mirror the South African case, is that what you have is peace without justice. So
Precisely.
in my mind, what has happened over the last 26 years now is really peace without justice.
Yeah.
Because those who have lost the most out of apartheid have ultimately not regained the most, right? So we have a balance of political power by the Black majority, but economic power by the continued economic power by the white minority. So you have peace without justice, right? And that's why reparations is so important, because, like I said, the reparations is about recognition. You know, when I spoke on the 105th commemoration earlier this year with the Eastern region of Anchor, I said that reparations is multidimensional. It's about responsibility. It's about recognition. It's about rehumanization. It's about rectification, and it's about redemption, right? So we have to understand that reparations isn't, oh, here's some money, or here are some grants or some loans. It is first admitting and taking responsibility that something I did was wrong.
And if you can't empathize, if you don't see the person sitting across the table from you an equal in terms of, being a human being deserving of the same rights you are, then you will find ways to get out of that situation, to go through those steps that you mentioned.
And
And I
you
think,
are,
and you miss out on the most important part of that, which is redemption. I think
yes,
everyone deserves redemption, but through the steps that you outlined. It's interesting that when we talk about restorative justice or reparations specifically, the discussion seems to always turn, even in here in the United States, towards monetary compensation.
and that is why I outlined that, because it's not just about money. But Artie, you made a very important point about restorative justice. There is an Nguni or Kosa term from South Africa, and it's called Ubuntu. It's also found in Swahili, and it literally means people are people through other people, right?
That's beautiful.
I am because we are, to translate it more literally, or to think of it another way. The wellness of the community is intricately tied to the wellness of the individual, and vice versa.
Amen. Amen.
So
And I'm glad to
can't,
learn a word in Inkosa that I can actually pronounce.
yes, Ubuntu. And so that concept, as the model of restorative justice, focuses on first the humanity and the dignity, first of those who have been aggrieved, and also of the aggressor, right? So restorative justice isn't easy. Most people think of it as, okay, it's easy. It's much easier to go and to meet in a court of law, and then the court concludes that you are guilty, and this is the monetary award. But restorative justice says responsibility and accountability and the redemption of the perpetrator group. So we first have to step back to see how demanding restorative justice is. We often think of it as easier, but if you are really going to do it the right way, in the way I just outlined, it is far more demanding than retributive justice.
It is, and it's hard, I think, for both parties. It's not easy. Forgiveness, getting to a better place is a journey that, if it was easy, everyone would do it.
Exactly.
It takes hard work, and even those of us who try to have an open mind oftentimes are diverge from that road. Now, turning things closer to home here in the States, you've been very outspoken about the recent discussions related to race here in our country. You may have seen that in Glendale recently, we passed a sundown town ordinance acknowledging the past wrongs that had been committed. And we spoke a little bit about this earlier. Do you see similarities between the Black American experience and the Armenian experience at all? How are they similar? How do they differ?
Yeah, I see several aspects of similarity, because in many ways the Black American and the Armenian experiences are both often denied, or almost done what Ungor calls organizing oblivion. It's almost to rewrite it out of history, right? This was part of how the genocide was effected, to write it out of existence. And in writing it out of existence, the Armenians were often written out of existence. The same with so much of what African Americans have faced in this country, that kind of trauma has been glossed over. So what I think of as the primary unifier with Armenians and African Americans is the character and the consequence of unresolved historic trauma, right? The historic trauma first of racism, and the historic trauma of the continued denial of the genocide of the Armenian people, right? When we think about these two things, and when we think about the nature of trauma, we realize that both these groups are locked into what I call transgenerational trauma, right? This collective idea of trauma, I think, is important and is often undervalued in the approach that either Armenians or African Americans take, right? When you think of the need for confraternity across these two groups, you begin to realize that both groups also need to have something done that they can shed this identity of trauma. And that thing, though it's not really just a thing, is reparations, right? First, acknowledging the atrocities that were done to Black Americans, rising to the level of genocide, because though the word was not yet created, the conditions within which many Black people lived in this state were genocidal, right? And to then acknowledge the reality that the Armenian genocide has continued for 105 years because the perpetrator country and group have thought it not necessary to do something about it. And so that is a great commonality. I think they differ too in one respect. And I think of this respect as socially constructed, but though very relevant, that in many ways, Armenians who are here in the US can be absorbed into white America, and therefore think of themselves as distinct and forming a different group than Black Americans. And therein lies part of the deceit of racism, that it keeps us divided in such a way that it makes our struggles, and I'm talking both the Black struggle and the Armenian struggle, it makes each of those groups think that I can only advocate for my injustice and I will leave everyone else to advocate for theirs. And therein lies part of the problem of the divisiveness of racism, that both Armenians and African Americans must understand the importance of looking at the nature of their collectivized relationship through historical trauma and work together to both remove the specter of racism here in the US, and in turn to also support the acknowledgement and the reparations for the Armenian genocide.
Yeah, when I made comments at city council meeting regarding the Sundown Town resolution, I referenced some of the words of Charles Gary, who was born Garabed Garabedian in Fresno and became a defense attorney and was a defense attorney for Huey Newton and Bobby Seale.
Yes.
And, the founders of the Black Panther Party. And when asked, and the Black Panthers were given a lot of grief within their own community for having a quote unquote white attorney. And, Charles Gary was given a lot of grief from white Americans saying, why are you defending the Black Panther Party? And his response was, growing up in Fresno with the discrimination and injustices that I faced, I knew what it was like to be Black, but I was able to change my name and, assimilate into white American society, whereas a Black person cannot do that. So I understand very well. He said, especially after becoming a defense attorney, I understood it even better as to what the struggle is. So, it's, I do see the commonalities as well. It's one of the reasons why my moral compass always points me towards standing with my Black friends and African-American brothers and sisters, and just generally people of all races across the world who feel oppression as Armenians in Artsakh today are feeling. And given sometimes the loneliness of that struggle when you stand alone. But we're here today having this discussion, proving to the world that neither of us stand alone, that we have allies, we have incredible academics like you who are doing the work to make the world a better place. So I want to thank you for that, Jermaine.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And, I love the quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he says that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so we have to guard ourselves against becoming so esoteric and parochial that we're only focusing on the cause that directly impacts us. And as you know, Ardi, that's part of the reason why I've been involved in, not just academic work, but advocating for recognition of the Armenian genocide, because this is not just of academic interest, but it's taking Dr. King's words seriously, that if you're going to be worried about injustice only encroaching on your doorstep, you have to bear in mind that when it encroaches on someone else's, it may be a precursor a harbinger to injustice reaching you. I think a lot of what is happening with social justice protests across the Americas, especially in the United States, is this idea that I can't wait until I am aggrieved to support those who are aggrieved. If we are a commonality of humanity because we belong to one race, ultimately the human race, then we have to understand that. And I want to make reference to something that is often elided in the conversation, but for me, as a political scientist, as an Africanist, but also as someone who is a Christian, focusing on the clear articulation of the importance of the confraternity, of thinking of everyone as brothers and sisters, the relationship of Armenia and Ethiopia, right? When I look at these kinds of things, it gives me pause to say, look, we actually have far more in common than we have apart. These are the two oldest Christian nations in the world. And Ethiopia, the longest unbroken nation in the world. But here we have these two nations. The sons and daughters of these two nations should certainly think of themselves as united in a common cause, right? Armenians, it was fascinating to learn that Armenians were settled into Ethiopia, that Haile Selassie's jeweler was Armenian.
The emperor adopted 40 Armenian orphans.
Yes.
And,
yes.
You know, he is a great, great figure for all of world history, for standing up against Italian fascism and fighting with all of his might. You know, I'm very proud to say that, you know, in 1952, I believe, the great Emperor Selassie, one of the longest lineages of royal family, visited our city, visited, I believe, the Glendale Adventist Hospital, and I've always had that close kinship with our Ethiopian friends who are of one church, the Apostolic faith.
Yes,
and so, of course, the influence of the Ethiopian royal family, of course, on Jamaican culture as well.
Yes, yes. And so when you think of all of these things, you realize that the ways in which we have diverged and made distinctions across each other, especially these groups, that is Blacks here in the US especially, and Armenians, you realize that there's far more of a foundation towards common cause than we have been willing to accept and to admit. And so I think both groups, both Black Americans and Armenians need to understand this, that going forward, you have to be, you know, cognizant of this confraternity and use it to focus on justice in both these situations. Why? Because inherited trauma is real. When you think of Armenians, you think of the traumatic identity shaped by the genocide. When you think of African Americans, all of the predations, though Africa had millennia and millions of years of history before slavery, the African American identity in its most modern incarnation focuses on slavery. So these two traumatic events and realities should bring us together far more than it should separate or divide us.
Amen. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I want to thank you for your time today that you have so generously given. I know that right after this, you're hopping on another Zoom call, and you had two before this. Professor, doctor, friend Jermaine, thank you so much for joining me. And I know that we'll be in touch again soon. In the meantime, stay safe, stay strong, and stay in touch.
Thank you very much. And we stand for not just Black Lives Matter, but to recognize Artsakh. Thank you, my friend, Ardi.
Take care.